So is my wife. I spend a lot of time up in Montreal.
Oh yeah, I love Montreal. Yeah. Good afternoon.
Nice.
Thank you, and welcome to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Cameron Hudson. I direct the museum's Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, and I want to thank everyone for coming out today. To be honest, I'm a little disappointed and quite angry that we have to be here again. 5 years after the conflict in Syria began, Hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians died, the displacement of millions more. And yet, we still have not summoned the courage, the creativity, or the will to protect those caught in this death spiral and erase this stain on our conscience. Today, if you visit the second floor of this museum, you'll see a room devoted to the conflict in Syria that tells the story of displacement and deprivation suffered every day by the millions of Syrians displaced from their homes and from their families. It is there not simply to raise awareness or to bring light to the individual stories of those most affected by the conflict. It is a message to the millions of young and old who visit this institution every year that crimes against humanity and genocide are not relics of history, that this plague of the 20th century occurs not only in black and white, and not only through grainy newsreel footage. It is happening today in full view, in full color for the world to see. These crimes are being committed on our watch, at a time when we have the power to speak up and act. This question, which so often beguiles those who tour through our permanent exhibition of the Holocaust, what would I have done? That question must be asked of all of us today. What am I doing? What will I do? To help us grapple with this question, we have an exceptional panel here to help make sense of all of these questions and address future challenges ahead. I want to call everyone up to the stage and do some quick introductions so we can get to this conversation. First, Adam Ento is national security correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and has written extensively about the conflict in Syria and the U.S. response. Robert Satloff, seated to the speaker's right, is the executive director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the Howard Berkowitz Chair in U.S. Middle East Policy, and I think one of the keenest observers and analysts on politics in this region. Qutayba Idlibi, a native of Damascus, is the co-founder and director of operations for People Demand Change, an international development organization that works to expand and strengthen civil society in the Middle East and North Africa, and as a research analyst for Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. Our discussion today will be moderated by Naomi Kiekeler, who is the deputy director of the museum's Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide. Before I turn it over to Naomi, I want to pay particular welcome to both the many Holocaust survivors who volunteer here in the museum who are joining us today, and to our many friends from Syria and from the Syrian activist community who are here with us today. We lift up the work that you do, but are grateful for the partnership that we have in helping to tell these stories. So thank you very much for being here. I want to remind everyone in the audience and those who might be joining us through our webcast that we are tweeting and live tweeting this discussion with the hashtag #WithSyria, and we'll be taking questions from the audience at the end of this discussion and through Twitter as well using that same hashtag. So with that, I turn it over to you, Naomi. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron, for those very moving words. And thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today as we mark this solemn event. I wanted to just start briefly by mentioning that the Center for the Prevention of Genocide has been dedicated to drawing awareness to the plight of Syrians over the past 5 years. And in that capacity, I've traveled to the border a couple of times, including most recently for the museum in September. And some of the photos from the various kind of refugee camps that I visited in Iraq will be shown behind us as we talk. I wanted to just start by sharing kind of one small story of an individual who I met. And I think it's important to start by just mentioning that on each of my trips, I've spoken to a lot of the same people. And what I've noticed over the past 5 years is just the growing despair that many Syrians feel over this continued conflict. and a real sense of desperation over what will happen to their country. Will they ever be able to go home? And just to put a human face on one particular person, I met a young man who is truly a hero and who Adam actually has written about as well. He was an engineer who, when the conflict broke out, started to work for a local council to try to ensure that the basic services that are needed to make sure that people have food, medicine, access to education could still be up and running. He stayed in Syria despite actually being wounded in the course of a bombing. He stayed in Syria despite the fact that his wife said to him over and over again, each day when you leave, I fear that I have lost you because I don't know if you're going to come home. Finally, when he left, and I have to say he is someone who also, from the perspective of the museum, did something quite remarkable. He helped preserve the artifacts of a very historic synagogue in Syria. He left because a fighter put a gun to his baby's head. And for him, after 4 years of living through the conflict, he finally had to go. And he was living as a refugee outside of the country, but still very much committed to trying to do everything that he can in exile to help preserve not just the lives of Syrians, but the very social fabric of what Syria meant for all those who lived there. So I thought, just as a starting point, I could turn it over to you, Kataiba, and if you'd be able to share with us, what are you hearing from your friends and family who are still in Syria about what's happening today, about the threats and challenges that they face, and how have you seen the conflict evolve over the last 5 years on the ground?
First, I want to thank you for having me here. I think, as you said, despair is really the right word to describe how people feel right now. I remember early on, since the revolution started, people had huge hopes that, for change, for democracy, for freedom. Remember going out to the streets, everyone believed, and I think this is really important, Syrians really went out to the streets on March 2011 because they had a huge belief in the international community that is going to help them, that is going to support them. And I think this is a huge part which actually helped them go to the streets. But through the time till today, I think those hopes kind of disappear. Early on, since I left Syria, I would, in the dark days of the revolution, I would call it, I would talk to my friends inside, my brother, other friends, and I try to get hope out of them, through what they tell me, through the work they're doing, how they continue to survive through the war, the institutions they started, the local councils, all the work done on the ground was very helpful. But we got to the times nowadays where I would talk to the people on the ground, and they will ask me, "What is in you? Why do you think we should continue doing this? Tell us something that at least should give us some hope while everything is going on." Because right now, we got to a critical moment where actually all Syrians inside, they believe there's a conspiracy against them. No one wants them to get freedom. No one wants them to build a new country. No one wants Assad as a criminal to step down, which is very critical and very helpful, of course, for extremist ideology. But it is this moment where we are at this moment where Syrians really are looking for any hope, anything that can help them. Even the news there were news yesterday about the Russian withdrawal from Syria, and even though for a lot of us here in DC it didn't really make sense, why would they do it and what is going to happen, everyone on the ground was just happy, even though it wasn't really a result of what the Syrians did, but they felt this can give them, even if it's a false hope, they will go with it. I think this is what people's need, and I need to recall again for the early days of the revolution, and today is March 15th, and on March 15th, 2011, it was also a Tuesday, by the way, and I remember a week after this, we had a small meeting, a small gathering for activists and notable people from the opposition, and we were talking about demonstrations, what should we do, how should people go out, and I remember someone in the room asked, why shall we go out to the streets if we know that Assad is going to shoot on people, and if we know that if the government is going to crack down, people are going to get killed, why should we take that responsibility? And I think maybe I was too naive at that point, but I 100% believed. I answered him. I told him, because international community is not going to allow Assad to do that. No one in the world is going to just watch out while Assad is going to shoot on people or kill people in jail. Or even, I didn't even think that we're going to get to the point where Assad is going to be using airplanes and all of that. And I think it is, yeah, it is at this moment and today, after exactly 5 years, we should ask ourselves, what did we do to meet those hopes of the Syrian people 5 years ago?
Thank you, Katam. It's incredibly powerful as we realize that 11 million Syrians are currently living displaced, many of them outside of their own country. And over 1 million are living today in besieged communities where they are being deprived of food and basic services on a daily basis. Rob, I was wondering, would you be able to maybe put this in a bit of a historical context? You're such a keen kind of follower of Middle East politics, but also very intimately familiar with the Holocaust and this museum as well.
Thank you, Naomi, and thank you very much for asking me to participate in this. It's really quite a privilege, and my heart goes out to you and your family and your countrymen. You know, it's a legitimate question. Here we are at the Holocaust Museum. And yet, what is happening in Syria, terrible though it is, look at the numbers, it doesn't even begin to approach the magnitude of the Holocaust. And I think it's important to put that out there. You know, let's look at the numbers just for a minute. About 250,000, more or less, people ruthlessly killed in Syria. That is about 4% of the number killed in the Holocaust of just Jews. 6 million Jews, 250,000 Syrians. Look at the number of people who escaped. The number of people who escaped. If you look at the Holocaust Museum's website and you add up the number of Jews who managed to get out, the total number is about 500,000. Well, 16 times as many Syrians have escaped. More than 4 million have managed to find refuge outside the country. And then just look at the countries that have come into Syria to act. And a lot of countries fought in World War II, but not one country fought to help the Jews. And a lot of the countries that are involved in Syria are Sunni Arab countries trying to help other Sunni Arabs. So there are some really profound differences. But, and this is the big, big, big but, is that really the yardstick that we have to judge our activity by and judge our efforts by in 2016? If something doesn't rise to the, or get down to the depths of the Holocaust, do we really have to wait for millions and millions to be killed for us to be prompted to act? I think absolutely not. And in this regard, it's important to remember 3 other big differences in the opposite direction between the Holocaust and what's going on in Syria. Difference 1. Yes, leaders knew, and if you read closely the New York Times, you knew what was going on in Europe in the 1940s. But today, everybody knows what is going on in Syria. This is carnage 24/7. And everybody knows. There is no knowledge gap about what is going on. 2, Syria is a poor, weak, small country. This is not Germany, the superpower of Europe in the mid-20th century. This is not some 10-foot-high Superman that we or anybody else should have been afraid of. This is a small, weak, impoverished, mid-sized Middle Eastern country. And third, and this, to me, as someone who follows closely American politics and American history, the third is perhaps the most enervating and outrageous. If you go upstairs and you look at the permanent collection, you will see the famous letter from John McCloy about why we didn't bomb, why the Pentagon did not bomb, wasn't the Pentagon yet, why the War Department did not bomb Auschwitz. And basically, if you follow the story, you know that lots of different people pointed fingers elsewhere. He didn't do it, he didn't do it, I didn't get the order, I was only following orders. It was an act of, people were shamed about this. Somehow, in our political culture today, it became not an act of shame, but perversely an act of great moral courage not to act in Syria. If you read statements by our political leaders, somehow the greatest achievement of the last half dozen years, a great act of political courage, was to withstand the consensus and not to act to save hundreds of thousands of people. This is perverse. And so I truly congratulate this museum for holding this event and for focusing more broadly at a time when conscience and courage and morality seem so absent from our political life, for re-injecting that in when and where it is needed so deeply.
Thank you for that. I think you've raised a number of really kind of probing points. I think the first one actually might speak to some of the work that Adam's been doing, which is, there is this theory amongst those of us who work on atrocity situations, and especially those of us who are human rights advocates, that as long as we are able to draw attention, as long as we can tell the story, show the images in real time of what's happening, be it in Syria or anywhere else in the world, that will put pressure on political actors. That will galvanize action, and action theoretically that'll be taken to save lives. Yet I think, as Rob just outlined, there's a massive gap here. It seems to be showing that some of our assumptions perhaps are deeply flawed. And I was just wondering, because you have been writing about some of the most heinous crimes that have been committed. You've outlined what happened in regards to the Caesar photos that we're showing here in the museum. And I was wondering if you could share from your perspective what it's like to be trying to show that there's an urgent need to act, and just how you feel, especially at this 5th year of reflecting over the past 5 years of what impact has the media had in trying to kind of force a conversation here.
Yeah, well, I think the audience needs to understand I work for a newspaper, and most of the action that's taken is driven by television. So I'm writing stories that I find personally to be touching, finding examples of people that are involved in the uprising in Syria, victims of the regime, that I think I can humanize the story to try to make the average reader empathize with the person who's making real life decisions. But I just want to say, with regard to what Robert talked about, how people know what's happening in Syria, and it made me think of I was in Israel to cover the Gaza war, the last Gaza war, and I remember the saturation of coverage from the hill overlooking Sderot, and you had Wolf Blitzer, going into the tunnel. And, you had reporters running around Gaza, you had reporters running around Israel, giving that was 24-hour coverage. And the war in Syria is not being covered that way. There's an asymmetry of coverage. And that is part of the reason I think that the pressure hasn't built. It's because you just can't cover it that way. It's too dangerous. Western news organizations just can't send people in. There is this disconnect because of who are the victims. It just is very difficult for reporters who want to shed light on this to do it in a way that is as impactful as you can when it's another conflict, that it's easier for the television cameras to be there and show what happens live. Imagine if the chemical attack took place, the big one in 2012, and imagine if there was a CNN crew that was in the area that was able to beam that out when it was happening. You know, when you look of why did the White House decide to respond to Benghazi in Libya, there was a radio broadcast of you know, Gaddafi was going to march on Benghazi, and so Susan Rice felt the pressure, and she brought the pressure to the president. What's happened in Syria has evolved so painstakingly slow and without the constant attention, because it's just too dangerous for journalists, and particularly television journalists, to be in there to report on what's happening. So I actually don't think the pressure has been as great as it would be if the circumstances were different.
I'm curious on the question. I mean, I like the phrase that you had there. It's not an act of shame. And I'm wondering, you know, from the perspective you were talking, Kataba, about the hopes and the dreams and the expectations of the Syrian people at the start of the uprising. And I'm just wondering, when you, as a Syrian who yourself has been a victim of Assad's atrocities, think about kind of responsibilities and U.S. responsibilities to prevent these crimes from happening, to protect populations, how do you understand what you would want the U.S. to do? What is it that you would expect of the U.S. government?
I think, I mean, Syrians have a lot of expectations. I think I'm not expecting anyone, not the U.S., especially to meet everything what the Syrians want, because every country, of course, would act depending on their national interest, depending on a lot of factors in general. But I think, especially reflecting, I mean, what happened in the Holocaust in World War II, we have a major responsibility to protect the people, to protect civilians, especially in Syria, to prevent another genocide. I mean, we're talking about an ongoing genocide right now that is not stopping. But I think there's a huge responsibility, if we don't want to act politically, it's actually to act on a humanitarian level, not only to give aid to the people. I mean, it's barely, we are the, you know, the most generous government. We're giving the most amount of aid between the other members of the United Nations, but still this is like giving a bandage to a cancer patient. This is not going to solve a problem. What Syrians need protection from aerial bombings, from chemical attacks. In 2012, when the chemical attacks started from Assad, we started by 29 attacks in 2012. And we're talking about, right now in 2015, we're talking about more than 340 attacks a year after the red lines and after Assad gave his chemical weapons. So obviously Assad is escalating. We were talking before about Syrian airfare being used, and then starting September 2015, we started talking about Russian airfare also, and more advanced weapons used mainly against civilians. So if the U.S. I mean, the minimum we should be doing here is actually acting up to protect civilians, to have areas where civilians, at least, and Syrians can go home safely and not having, you know, aerial bombing and shelling and everything. And for Syrians in general, what they hope for the U.S. is actually not to help them through to get home safely in peace, not only from, and being protected not only from aerial bombing, but being actually protected and having the ability to live in their homes without anyone knocking on their doors early in the morning to arrest a member of their family, where those members will disappear forever, or when they would come back maybe months or years after with wounds, I mean, and spiritual, like psychological wounds and physical wounds. That's the peace that Syrians want. We want peace, yeah, where like we can have our homes safely, but yeah, we want peace where Assad government would not be able to hunt us one by one from our homes because we participated in the revolution, because we stood up and say no. And even if you look right now at the numbers, I mean, Assad government took the city of Homs over a year ago. How many people went back to Homs? No one. The refugees, whether they're in Jordan or in Lebanon, they're afraid to go back to their houses because they don't know what's the government reaction is going to be, because they were leading the revolution. At the same time, those who were inside Syria even and who tried to visit their relatives' houses, they were not allowed into the area because Assad himself is not allowing anyone back in. And if you look at Idlib, which was taken by the rebels around the same time as well, 2 weeks after we're talking about more than 100,000 refugees went back there to their destroyed houses to rebuild it, to live there, because they believed even though with the minimum shelling and bombing happened, they preferred that and living in freedom than living in a refugee camp. I think that's the minimum we can do. On a more political level, I think we have a huge responsibility, a moral responsibility, to hold the criminals accountable, to hold whether it's not only ISIS but also Assad government for all the crimes that they did for the Syrian people. So we can tell this, and this is not only for us, this is for the future. So in the future, it would be, so this can really be a never again moment where no one in the future would think, oh, Assad did it in the back, he was not held accountable, I can do it to my people too. I can kill more than 500,000 people. And we talk here about numbers, even according to the Syrian Center for Policy Research, we're talking about more than 500,000 people were killed directly because of the war. And more than 700,000 people were killed because of the medical situation in Syria because of the war. So we're basically talking about 1,200,000 killed. And I would say maybe less than 1%, those were ISIS and Al-Qaeda responsibility, and 99% were Assad and Russia and Iran responsibility. So if we don't really put a method here and tell Assad and other criminals that this needs to stop, for the future being, it might not be in Syria, it might be somewhere else, but we should put an example and tell whoever would think about this that this should never happen.
You've outlined kind of in great detail what civilians are actually facing in terms of the aerial bombardment and the conditions. And I'm curious, because Rob, your initial question begs that kind of reflection on the regional actors. We can kind of determine what some of their interests are. There's some that have been very clear about either preserving Assad's position or in removing him. I'm curious from your perspective, when we look at the US government and their outcome, what's the outcome that's desired, and where does civilian protection, preventing atrocities, fit into it, given that we have talked a lot about the importance of never again and spreading kind of human rights values internationally?
It's very difficult to identify precisely what outcome the US government would like. And I think that's a fairly polite way of describing this moving situation. Look, historically, there's a trade-off with situations like this. Usually there's a trade-off between America's strategic interest and our humanitarian concerns. And different arms of the US government, one argues do something for our strategic interest, and the other argues in a totally opposite way to do something for your humanitarian concerns. What is so unique about the Syria case, which is why American inaction is so confounding, is that our interests, our strategic interests, and our humanitarian concerns are parallel. They are synonymous. They do not conflict in Syria. They intersect. They are the same. We should be much more actively engaged in Syria, not just because it's the right thing to do, because it's the smart thing to do. Look at what has happened since our inactivity, our reluctance to engage. The Russians came in and played a significant role in a part of the region where we have, for over 2 generations, ensured they play no role at all. B, the Iranians have come in a much more assertive way, projecting their own force and projecting those of their allies, taking them to the Mediterranean. So now the Iranians are critical actors and power brokers from Lebanon through Syria, through Iraq, to Iran. That's an entire northern tier of the Middle East in which the Iranians play a major role. 3, ISIS has expanded. I mean, say what you will, the Russians didn't do anything about ISIS. The Russians went in to help Assad. And despite all their big talk about helping ISIS, they're leaving. And ISIS is still in control of at least around half the country. So all this baloney about, the Russians will do the job, total malarkey. Nobody did the job. And ISIS is still as powerful, if not more so, than when the Russians arrived. This begs, why aren't we engaged to protect the people, prevent the Russians from asserting their broader influence, protect the Iranians, and pushing back on ISIS. And there are things that we could have done, not the Hail Mary pass, not sending in the 82nd Airborne, not dispatching another 500,000 troops, that would have changed the situation profoundly on the ground. And so when you ask me what is our goal, it is unclear. It really is. I wish I could say it was clear. Yes, we want Syria to stay as a state. Yes, we want the fighting to end, but we're not willing to inject leverage to bring about that goal. And so we talk a lot, but in this part of the world, you got to do something if you want to bring about your goal.
Just picking up on that point, Adam.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, you know, I think, you know, there is this lack of clarity about what the administration's position is. But when you look over time, it really boils down to containment. What the administration wants to do is contain the crisis, minimize the investment that the U.S. needs to make in trying to reach an outcome that is would remove Assad. And so you have these competing strategies where you had Turkey, Saudi Arabia, for example, having a regime change policy, and the administration of the United States vocalizing a regime change policy, but not being prepared to take concrete steps to bring that about. And so it averted to a containment strategy, which basically was preventing it from getting spilling outside of its borders, preventing it from getting any worse, reducing the risk that you have in Iraq 2.0, where the U.S. has to go in and own another broken country. And so that mismatch of objectives resulted in basically what happened when Turkey decided to open its border and let anybody who was willing to come to Syria to fight the regime, because its goal was regime change. And you had the United States, which basically was thinking of lessons from Afghanistan in the 1980s and Iraq in 2003. Does it want to get more entangled in this? So Dempsey, who at the time was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he articulated a containment strategy, and that really has been the American position. And it's, you know, for better or worse, that's been the consistent course. And the administration has been very good at resisting pressure to do more. You know, they obviously are bouncing between whatever option sort of pops up at the moment that they're hoping is an opportunity to achieve one of their goals, which is containment. They do genuinely want to reduce the death toll. There's no question they want to do that. And after we saw ISIS send fighters to Europe, obviously a counterterrorism goal is clear. I mean, this administration wants to achieve these things, but wants to achieve them without having to make a major American investment, and that would be boots on the ground. They just aren't prepared to do that. And so there are limits on what you can achieve without doing that. And so that's where we find ourselves with the half measures, which nobody's satisfied with, but which the White House thinks is preventing the United States from getting dragged into a quagmire.
Just before I think we'll take questions from the audience, what strikes me is our conversation is focused a lot on really the last year or two post kind of the crossing of the red line with chemical weapons. And it does strike me that perhaps in that first year, there would have been other courses of action available through preventive diplomacy and building a coalition, not for a military response, but really to try to avert this crisis from metastasizing in the way that it has. But you know, that's from the prevention of genocide from our center's perspective, really what we're hoping to encourage future administrations to really prioritize engaging at a much earlier stage before we see the types of atrocities that Qutaiba has been describing. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience. There are roving microphones, so if you could raise your hands, or if there's questions from the internet. Thank you. Dan? Oh, we're not there.
Hi, I'm Don Kraus. One thing that hasn't been mentioned at all in this conversation is the simple words United Nations. This organization, which was established to end the scourge of war after serial vetoes from Russia and China, was really pushed to the sidelines. It certainly has helped some in terms of setting up some of the staging for diplomacy, but and humanitarian aid, but it really has been really pushed away in terms of actually being able to prevent or end this conflict. What should be happening there in terms of what the U.S. should be doing or other member states should be doing?
Who would like to take a stab at that?
Look,
Rob,
all right, look,
stuck with that.
I mean, Naomi knows a lot more about the United Nations than I'll ever know. So I feel like she should be participating. I'll offer my 2 cents. When you have great powers, Security Council members that are clashing like this, the Security Council is unlikely to be the forum for a resolution. Security Council reflects the leverage and the influence of its members. So it's not going to, we shouldn't be surprised that the Security Council isn't solving this. I do want to put a word in for the agencies that are helping refugees and that are getting food in to besieged communities in Syria. They are true heroes every day for what they do. This is hard work, dangerous work, and they deserve everyone's support. That's not going to solve the problem. It will require, in my view, my humble view, changing the balance of leverage and risk on the ground. And what the Russians did over the last 6 months is very instructive here. I mean, the Russians actually came in, changed the balance on the ground, mostly through air power, a very small number of Russian ground presence, relatively small number, changed the balance on the ground. And now, I mean, we have to see exactly what happens, but they look like they're leaving. Oh, what a remarkable story. A great power can come in, almost totally in the air, very small numbers of ground forces, and leave without getting caught in the muck of quagmire. Fascinating example, isn't it? Now, I know that there's more details here, but and there's a lot more going on, but I think this is a very instructive example of how, if you are committed to changing leverage on the ground, there are ways to do it at relatively small cost.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've seen with the way the Russians have used the United Nations, it has been a strategy that the Russians have employed to try to avoid accountability for the regime and to protect the regime. For example, when it comes to the use of chemical weapons, the Russians will bring forward, will basically use the UN to try to protect, avoid the regime needing to come clean about its role in that attack. And that's something which I think a lot of people inside the administration and who are at the UN find that incredibly frustrating, because obviously the UN has a incredibly important role to play, but the nature of the Security Council gives a great deal of power to the permanent members, including the Russians. And so, who in the Assad regime is responsible for, that horrendous chemical attack? Will anybody be held accountable? I think it's very hard to tell. And is the UN part of the solution for that, or is the UN part of the problem? I think that's a worthwhile debate. As to the I do think that it comes down to this. The Russians were much more committed to Assad than the United States is committed to the moderate rebels, and that asymmetry of commitments, showed that the Russians could do and were willing to take they were willing to take risks that the Obama administration hasn't been willing to take, and it has to do. both with interests where the Russians are trying to, in this case, in many ways, I think, show up the president and basically say Russia is a major power. And I think Putin accomplished that goal. At the same time, 3 months from now, who knows where this is going to be? It could be that the regime starts losing ground again, and then the question is Putin going to jump back in? So these are the kind of, what looks like a victory today could end up being a questionable decision down the road. So it's very early days on that.
Gentlemen.
Thank you. Simon Henshaw, State Department, Population, Refugees, and Migration. I just wondered if you could briefly comment on the cessation of hostilities, how you think it would play out, whether there's any possibility that this could lead to an eventual ceasefire.
I mean, I would talk more from the people's perspective on the ground, not truly into the political part. Even if things led to ceasefire, what's after? As I said, what Syrians really want is peace. But peace, as I said, where they would be safe from real fire from bullets and bombs, and peace and safe also from security forces, where they would not be hunted and be in one of those Caesar photos that you can see upstairs. That's what Syrians want. So as long as the ceasefire, and we're talking here, it's been 17 days. We're talking about 500, I read the number this morning, I think it's 569 breaches till today in 16 days. Probably, I mean, we think it's it's holding up because we're not hearing a lot on the media about the breaches. Aerial bombardment is less on civilian areas, but Assad forces are still continuing actually to try to take grounds on the ground. In eastern Ghouta, they're trying to take Marij, which is the agriculture area of the besieged eastern Ghouta, which is primarily saving the lives of the people, the 400,000 people in eastern Ghouta, from starving to death. That's what Assad has been trying to take in the past 15 or 16 days. In Latakia, Assad forces are still trying also to take grounds. In southern Aleppo, it's still going on. Yes, bombardment is less on civilian areas that are away from the front lines. That was totally great. People were able to go out to the streets again and demand what they want. But is it good for the future? I mean, I don't think so, no.
Rob, would you like to?
Well, I think everyone should welcome the fact that there is a cessation of hostilities, such as it is. Fewer people are dying today than were dying a month ago, and that's good. And I think we should welcome that. And I personally think that John Kerry deserves a Medal of Honor again for going into battle with one arm tied behind his back. The Russian foreign minister went in to negotiate this, knowing full well that his president was committed and was willing to use force to achieve a certain a battlefield reality. And our diplomacy was deployed without that benefit. And the outcome is what we have. It's not the best. I feel particularly saddened about the idea that there's a ceasefire in which we and the Russians agreed not to identify violations, not to pinpoint violations. It's not as though we have anything to hide. We're not bombing civilians. The Russians have something to hide, clearly. And I feel badly that that this is the context of the cessation of hostilities. That being said, let's see, as Adam said, we don't really know what the implications yet are of the Russian withdrawal. Maybe it pushes Assad to think that he doesn't have a protector any longer. Maybe this has a positive impact in the negotiations that are just beginning to get underway. Somehow, I doubt that the redeployment of Russian troops truly means from Moscow to Damascus, Assad, you're on your own. I doubt that very much. But let's see. We have yet to see how this is going to play out. But I think, look, a cessation of hostilities, even an imperfect one, such as this one truly is better than full-blown day in, day out bombardments of every town, village, and city in the country.
Well, I think what one could see what the Russians did with their announcement of the major withdrawal from Syria as potentially a way for Putin to put Assad on notice that Putin didn't make a promise to stay forever and to help Assad win. Russia intervened to prevent Assad from losing, and that's pretty much what Putin can do. The issue is if this thing falls apart, and what happens next? Will the patrons backing the rebels double down or triple down in support of those groups? And I think the answer is probably yes. That means Saudi Arabia, it means Qatar, it means Turkey, investing more heavily in the rebels that are left, and potentially more extremist groups, because a lot of the moderate rebels were hard hit by the Russian intervention. And then the question will be to Putin, are you going to, when you start to see that the regime starts losing ground again, because I think the American assessment is this is a stalemate. Today it may look like the Assad regime has the upper hand, but in 3 months from now, the tables could be reversed. It's going to go back and forth. So is Putin, when this thing goes south, and if the patrons to the rebels double down, is Putin and is Iran going to double down? And I think the administration, and certainly folks in the intelligence community here, think that the lesson of what's happened recently with both the Iranians and the Russians is that there is a recognition that they are backing a Syrian army that frankly is not all that capable. If it wasn't for Russian air power, and if it wasn't for militia that were being inserted by the Iranians, the regime could seriously, potentially, have lost significant ground in key areas last year. And basically, if this goes back to a full-on civil war, all bets are off. It's really unclear which way this will go and whether the regime will come out on top. And I think, that was part of that's right now the calculation that Assad is probably making. He is talked about reclaiming his country, the entire country. And I think the Russians and the Iranians are realistic enough to know that that's probably never going to happen. So how willing are they going to be to double down and triple down the next time? They've already done it. They did it first time in 2012, and they saved Assad when he was in trouble. They did it in 2015, early 2016. Both times they were, successful at getting the Assad regime back. Will they be willing to do it later in 2016 if the tide turns again? And that's an open question that I don't think we know the answer to.
Rob, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one other point that I hope the Russian withdrawal, especially of Russian air forces, triggers a rethinking on our part of the wisdom of creating safe zones in Syria. One of the we've been having this ongoing low-level, sometimes higher level, sometimes makes it to the White House, internal debate on this issue for years, and there's always another excuse. The most recent big excuse was, well, how could we create safe zones if there are Russian planes there? Our planes and our patriots in Turkey will conflict with the Russians, and we don't want to start World War III. Well, the Russians, for whatever reason, thankfully, seem to be removing that excuse. I hope this provides an opportunity for us to rethink, because I remain convinced that it is that I think the most effective thing that we can do that will change the balance on the ground, that will ensure a slower refugee flow, that will have an impact on the negotiations, would be creating two safe zones in Syria, in the north and the south, at relatively little risk. I mean, there's always risk, but at relatively little risk to us and our forces. And I hope that we are now reconsidering that.
Let's take another question from the audience.
Brittany Stanek. I don't have a fancy title because I'm just a college student. As a college student, I constantly run into people who don't think that this issue is important to them and that they don't need to bother to get involved with it. What would you tell people in my generation about why they should be passionate about the issue?
That's a phenomenal question, and it's actually one that we have internally been wrestling with as well. There was a great Save Darfur movement that drew attention to the plight of Darfuris. We've seen a lot of mobilization around different crises. There's no Save Syria movement. There's no strong outcry from the public. Curious for your reflections. I know maybe I'll start with Adam, just from your unique vantage point.
Yeah. I don't know. From from where I sit, I'm trying to tell stories, that affect people and make you, realize that the people who are suffering wherever they are just like you and I, and they have families, and but as to why and how to make young people, college students, motivated into this. I know a lot of the activists, and they're young people, most of them, and they obviously are pulled to it because of maybe family ties to it, or there's another reason that they're directly linked to it. But I really struggle with the idea of how do you get people to be more engaged, because frankly it's a foreign language to a lot of people. It's a foreign culture. How do you relate to it? It's a tough one, and I think from a journalist perspective, the goal is really to tell stories that transport you there and make you feel for the victims and for regular people, so you understand that they're just like you and I, and they want to send their kid to go to college too, and that's sort of my role in the process.
Just to add a thought, as a father of a college student myself, and having these sorts of discussions around the dinner table, just something I came back to, I mentioned earlier a few moments ago. Look, there's a lot of terrible things that are going on in the world. Syria is a unique case where it is both right and smart to act. There are a lot of places where it's right to act. And there are a lot of places where it's smart to act, but it may not be right. Syria is a case where it's right and smart. Make that case.
I mean, I would like to ask that question myself, why there is no Syria moment here. I mean, we've seen the president, the first lady, hugging Ebola survivor, because everyone was saying like, oh, everyone is coming from Africa has Ebola. But I didn't see the president or the first lady have any role actually in bringing this to surface. And a lot of, especially in policy, a lot of people talk about, oh, the people would not like it. Americans, they really, after Iraq and Afghanistan, they really don't want this. But we didn't really see any role from the leadership in actually leading the people and bringing them actually to be engaged with this. I've been to different places here in the United States in the past couple of years, from in Utah, in South Carolina, in Oklahoma, and all over. And wherever I go and I talk with people about Syria, I'm always being met with open hearts and tears on the cheeks. No one would come and tell me, oh, you know what, you're all terrorists in Syria, or all the bad stuff we hear on media and gets attention and it's sexy. You don't hear it when you talk with people really on the ground, because they really, when they hear what is going on, they get engaged and they realize, in the past 2 years, I've never told anyone that what the administration is doing wrong. It's the Americans who would come and tell me our administration is shameful because they're not doing anything on the ground on Syria. My main question is, yes, where is the leadership? Where is our administration in a leadership role to lead the country and get them engaged in what is going on? Why should young people be engaged with this? This might be so, this might be so personal, but I would say this is a great moment in history. It's it's not that every day or every 10 or 20 years that something, a great cause happened somewhere around the world, here in the US or anywhere around. And it's those moments in our life that I think it's worth it to catch those moments and work for those causes, for those noble things, because it's worth it in 50 years or something when your kids ask you, I read in history about this, it's worth it to tell them, I worked for these things. I tried to prevent it. I tried to help the people over there. If nothing is worth it, if the lives of people there is not worth it, those moments later on is totally worth it, I think.
I think it was appropriate you asked that question because I think we're going to end there. And I just wanted everyone to maybe kind of look at the photo that's behind, because what we're really trying to do is to be able to put a human face on what these crimes look like and the devastating toll. This is a young woman in a Syrian refugee camp in Iraq. Her family fled to Iraq 4 years before, and her home is a camp. It is a camp in which, when I was there, people were desperately trying to get out because despite the heroic works of the UN, there have been such food shortages that people don't even have enough food in these camps to be able to stay. And she had so much kind of joy of life, so much hope for what the future can be. And we need to be working to try to ensure that she has a future and that she can go home, and that for young people like her, there's 1/3 of all Syrian children have been born during this conflict. What will their future look like? And I hope that that's what emboldens us to try to continue to work to bring an end to this horrific conflict. Thank you so much for this very thought-provoking panel. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Cameron.
Thank you.
Sorry to sort of rush our panelists off the stage, but I wanted to invite to the podium the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Elliot Engel, who has agreed to join us today to offer some reflections from Congress. I understand we'll be joined by Chairman Royce in just a little bit as well. Actually, we are joined by Chairman Royce, right on cue, actually. That's good staffing, Congressman. I was going to defer to your colleague who's been patiently waiting. So, yes. Well, we'll let him go first, and I would just note that we've spoken a lot today about leadership, presidential leadership, and executive branch leadership. But the reason we've invited the chairman and the ranking member to join us today is they have shown tremendous leadership in Congress to shine a light on this conflict and to keep that light shining on this conflict. There was a remarkable piece of bill passed yesterday condemning the Assad regime for the atrocities that it's been committing and trying to hold to account. And so I just want to say thank you for the leadership you've shown and welcome your reflections here on this 5th anniversary. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for your kind words. I am very glad to be joining my good friend, Ed Royce, our chairman on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He and I work so closely together on so many issues and that we feel are just too important for partisan politics, advancing American interests and security abroad, pushing back against violence and extremism, helping to promote stability and prosperity on the global stage. I can tell you that I could search the entire Congress. I couldn't find myself a better partner than Ed Royce, and we pride ourselves on issues like this. They're not partisan issues. They're obviously bipartisan issues. They're issues of humanity. And we very much believe that when it comes to what America does on an international level, politics really needs to stop at the water's edge. And we pride ourselves in being the most bipartisan committee in Congress because foreign affairs needs to be bipartisan. There will be presidents of different parties. There will be Congresses of different parties. We're all Americans, and when there's a threat to us, it's a threat to all of us. And so I'm just delighted that Ed's here, and I'm delighted that he's the chairman of our committee. And we think alike on these issues. We have discussed Syria for years, and I tell you, it's just a tragedy in our lifetime. So I want to thank the Holocaust Museum and the Center for the Prevention of Genocide for hosting us today. This panel was terrific. I want to acknowledge members of the panel and people for courage and commitment. And we know that over the past 5 years, there's been no shortage of debate about how to deal with the crisis in Syria. There's finger pointing and hand wringing when it goes on. The situation is again and again descended to new and unthinkable, heartbreaking depths. I'm not interested in debating the mistakes of the last 5 years, but I will tell you that when this first started, and we had many people from the Syrian resistance come to speak with us in Washington, I put in a bill now probably almost 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, to aid the Syrian rebels. I think we made a mistake by not doing it. Can't prove it because we didn't go in that direction, so we don't know what would have happened. But it seems to me that that Russia aggressively moved to shore up its position. We know Putin's pulling out. We know Putin can pull back in. I know Americans are tired of war, tired of what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, but this is a very important region of the world, which I think is a threat to us. So this is the time where the threat and doing the humanitarian and right thing is really on the same side. So I would hope that the Syrian people who had such high hopes 5 years ago, the Arab Spring, for all kinds of betterment in their country. The Assads have ruled Syria for many, many, many years. First the son, first the father, now the son. Things just seem to be getting worse, and Syrian people, like any people, certainly deserve better, and we must not forget them, and we must try as best we can to bring this brutal war to an end, to bring the humanitarian crisis to an end. These are civilians. We had thought that we would never see this kind of stuff again, and we're seeing it all over again. I can tell you on the Foreign Affairs Committee, we had pictures that were smuggled out of Syria showing corpses and all kinds of bodies. It reminded me something of the Holocaust in the 40s. Those same types of pictures, they just kind of give you goosebumps. And when you think that those people are just like us sitting here, just like us, same kinds of emotions, same kinds of humanity, same kinds of feelings, caring about our kids, caring about our parents, caring about our families. These are human beings who are being treated like animals, or maybe worse than animals. And I do believe the United States, as a leader of the free world, has an obligation and a right to do what's important. So, we need to ask ourselves, what will it take to end the violence and pick up the pieces of this broken part of the world? Because too many times I've really thought to myself, how can this possibly get any worse? Only to have that question answered again and again, just worse and worse and worse. Now, from a policy perspective, there are a few items worth mentioning now, so many years later. Knowing that nothing is a panacea, and that nothing is guaranteed to work, but I think we need to try. So I am open to a no-fly zone in Syria, aimed at hampering the Assad regime's air power. Of course, it would have to be deconflicted with Russia, which will still maintain air bases in Syria, even if the drawdown of troops goes forward. We need to continue leading the 66-country coalition that has made inroads against ISIS. We need to make sure our Arab partners with forces on the ground have the support and resources they need. On the humanitarian front, we need to keep pushing for better access to regime-controlled areas so we can get relief to those who need it most. We know, as I think was mentioned in the previous panel, that Putin entered the fray because he thought that the Assad regime was going to fall. And if it hadn't been for Russian intervention or the intervention of Hezbollah, which is an Iranian proxy and a terrorist organization, Assad would not be where he is today. So we do need to keep pushing for a diplomatic resolution in Syria that brings an end to the Assad regime and sets the stage for the Syrian people to rebuild and chart a new course for their country. But beyond the policy choices, I hope we'll start to make some progress. We need to constantly remind ourselves that there's always a terrible, terrible answer to the question, how can this possibly get worse? I don't think any of us foresaw several years ago that we would still be here at the start of 2016 and the situation would be worse and worse. The building that we're in here, the building that we're sitting in today, stands as a memorial to what happens when people just stand by, waiting for that question to be answered, rather than taking action, or put their head in the sand and pretend it's not happening, or say, you know what, it isn't happening to my people, so why should I care? That happened during the Holocaust of the 1940s, and to a large degree, it's happening in Syria today. Just yesterday, the House passed 2 resolutions. One said that ISIS has committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, against Christians, Yazidis, and other ethnic and religious minorities. The other one calls for the establishment of a war crimes tribunal to hold the regime and its allies accountable for their atrocities. Now, these are resolutions. They don't have the force of law, but they send a message about the way we in Congress, in both parties, view this crisis. We view it as the sort of barbarity we're describing when we use the phrase never again. So I hope that the leaders here and leaders around the world will remember this as this fire continues to burn out of control. Too many lives have been lost and ruined in the last 5 years, but we can still take a stand if we summon the will and remind ourselves what's at stake. If we don't, we may find ourselves here another 5 years down the road, wondering how a decade-old conflict could possibly get any worse. I hope we'll choose a different course and that we will do what's needed to end the violence, put a stop to ISIS, and get Syria on a course for a better future. The Syrian people deserve it. Humanity deserves it. We all deserve it. And we need to get work to make sure it happens. So thank you all for your partnership and your commitment. And again, it's been my honor to speak with you and my pleasure to work with Chairman Royce over the past 3 years. Thank you very much.
Chairman Royce, podium is yours.
Well, thank you. First, let me say that I want to recognize Elliot Engel for his leadership on this issue. He was the first 5 years ago to raise this issue of U.S. engagement there in terms of support for the Syrian people. I backed him then, and our committee certainly we feel the same way now about the issue of a safe zone, about these issues with respect to what is happening to the Syrian people. I grew up next to a Syrian family in Anaheim, California, and for the Syrian Americans that are here, I remember how concerned they were for their countrymen, their brethren back in Syria, given what had happened over the years. There was a dictatorship there, and still today, that persecuted people to such an extent, and it was a grave concern to them about the future of the country. And I think when we think back 5 years ago to the protest and the people in the streets marching, saying peaceful, peaceful, and then you saw the automatic weapons open up on the civilian population, and then month after month watched as from the press reports as people were captured, taken into by the intelligence services, 13 separate arms of the intelligence services or secret police in Syrian society, and then the stories began to come out. I don't think it was until we heard the specifics and saw the photographs from Caesar, who was the army photographer who smuggled those out, that we understood the enormity, because he brought out tens of thousands of photographs, the enormity of what had gone on in those torture chambers and in those at the hands of the secret police. But this marks a time now where we have had 400,000 people lose their lives. there in that conflict, and some 11 million, over 11 million, driven out of their homes, some driven out of the country, others displaced people within their own country. You know, it's proper that we're here today to discuss this in a place that is instilled with the principles of justice and equality and mercy, and a place whose mission is to ensure never again, but in fact, these types of things are happening again. And 2 years ago, we heard, as I say, from Caesar. And he was talking to us specifically about the systematic use of torture. And as he would explain, it was used against Sunnis, it was used against Alawites, against Kurds, against Christians, against anyone who was suspected. Anyone who was suspected could have been arrested. And we know their fate. And the other odd thing, and I don't know why totalitarian regimes do this, but this preoccupation with numbering the victims. And there again, we saw the numbers stenciled or drawn on their forehead, or a number attached to the body. But as they cataloged those who expired under that torture, or who were executed, he brought to the international community the proof in terms of what happened in those prisons. Men and women and children from all sects, all religions, their mangled bodies later released or dumped. And I think this sears the collective conscience. And I hope it continues to sear the collective conscience, including here at the museum, where they're going to be on display. And I would add another tool of war that Assad has used, and that is starvation, because that's another thing you saw in the photographs. Images similar to those same images that we see hanging here have come to us from cities like Medea and Daraa, showing the immense suffering of those who are under siege, who are intentionally being starved to death. And despite the recent cessation of hostilities, or maybe temporary cessation in some parts of the country, I think we are not focused on the fact that the UN Security Council resolution calling for access to besieged areas, calling for food and medicine to get into those areas, is being routinely blocked. Assad continues to block that delivery. We have also heard many, many times from the brave doctors, from SAMS and other groups of physicians who have gone in to put their lives in peril, and nurses, in order to go in and treat in this area. And I think when we think about their sacrifice, many of them Syrian Americans, 450 of them dead so far, doctors and nurses that have gone there to try to help. They also are the targets of the barrel bombs that hit the hospitals, that hit the civilian areas. And those barrel bombs are often filled with chlorine gas. And those doctors watch and recall to us children suffocating on their makeshift operating tables. We have been humbled by the actions of the Syrian civil defense authorities, the white hats, who run into buildings as those buildings fall to pieces. You watch on CNN after these attacks, and you see the white hats run in, rescuing neighbors, rescuing strangers, regardless of sect or religion or ethnicity. And all of these brave Syrians continue to serve their communities and country in the most selfless ways possible. And they are examples to us all. At the same time, ISIS and other extremist-linked fighters like al-Nusra have carried out grave crimes against the local communities under their control, all in an effort to impose a violent, radical ideology. And Daesh is a particularly grotesque operation in their celebration of the horror that they cause. Those tools include mass murder and beheadings, crucifixions and rape, and of course, torture and enslavement. They have committed genocidal acts in an effort to erase the existence and history of other groups, including Christians and Yazidis, and other ethnic and religious minorities. Experts told me that of the many ancient indigenous Christian communities that are in the areas which have fallen under Daesh, none now remain. So Daesh has clearly stated that it cannot abide the continued existence of the Yazidi community and has followed these statements up with widespread killing and enslavement. Last fall, members of my committee met with Bazi, who was a young Yazidi woman from Iraq, who bravely recounted her brutal captivity and abuse at the hands of this terrorist group. And Daesh has also acted on its proclaimed hatred for the cross worshippers in one of their gruesome videos addressed to Christians. Their spokesman taunts the so-called people of the cross, saying, "You will not have safety even in your dreams until you embrace Islam." His words were followed up by the gruesome image of 15 Christian captives beheaded on camera. In the past, the House of Representatives, and my committee in particular, led the push to recognize genocide in Sudan in the late 1990s. I remember the critical role we played in the debate. I actually led that debate. We have recognized genocide in numerous other situations, including Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia and elsewhere. And we are doing so again, drawing attention to the terrible atrocities being committed by Daesh, but also by Assad and his allies. And just yesterday, the House passed House Concurrent Resolution 75, labeling Daesh's actions as genocide, and House Concurrent Resolution 121, calling for the establishment of a war crimes tribunal to bring justice to the victims of Assad's atrocities. I look forward to the administration's long-awaited and long overdue genocide determination against Daesh, and I hope with a united voice we can together use the power of the United States of America to say we have not forgotten and we will not be silent, and we want also the recognition of House Concurrent Resolution 121, calling for the establishment of that war crimes tribunal so that there is an accounting for Assad. We will not accept these terrible atrocities, either by Assad or by Daesh. Thank you very much. I believe the House vote's going to come at 3:35, so I'm going to try to make that vote, but thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Margaret Meissner, and I'm a volunteer, and I'm a survivor of the Holocaust and a volunteer at the museum. And I'm very proud to be associated with the museum as the sponsor of today's event, calling attention to the ongoing violence in Syria. When I was asked to speak about the impact on a Holocaust survivor of the Syrian refugee crisis, I immediately focused on the hopeless faces of the Syrians who are trying to survive. They had the same hopeless look that I remember on my mother's face 75 years ago when she was deported by the French police. She was forced to leave me, abandoned and alone in Paris and in fear of the advancing Germans. I am really outraged and also saddened to stand here today, 5 years after the start of the Syrian conflict, and again calling on the conscience of the world to uphold the promise of never again. Last July, I spoke on Capitol Hill together with the previous speaker in front of policymakers and urged the international community to take immediate action to end the violence. Now, here we are again, almost a year later, and I'm very heartened by what I just heard both congressmen talk about, because I didn't know about it. Maybe my fault that I don't follow the press carefully enough, but it was not known to me. Today, scores of people across Syria are staging rallies to remember their peaceful uprising that eventually descended into an apocalyptic civil war. We join them by remembering the more than 240,000 or 400,000 people killed and the millions uprooted, largely because of the brutality of the Assad regime. The regime targets civilians to crush the spirit of the democratic protesters and advocating change. The Nazi method of brutalizing their unwanted citizens were equally cruel, but they were done in secret. The world did not know, and because of that was really not in a position to help. But the atrocities in Syria, as we see so clearly, are no secret. We see the photographs, we see the television images. For 5 years we have seen them now, and yet the international community has done very little to stop the perpetrators. The rise, of course, of the self-proclaimed Islamic State has made matters worse. Over 11 million people have been forced from their homes and their livelihood destroyed. That figure must be unacceptable to the policymakers in the United States and in the entire international community. I am aware that the Syrian problem is daunting for our leaders. Making the right decisions and creating effective responses requires real statesmanship, of which there seems to be very little in the world, with the exception of Angela Merkel. The present ceasefire agreement is a first hopeful sign, although, as you have heard, opposition groups have already cited multiple violations. Meanwhile, the need for humanitarian aid to hundreds of thousands of people in besieged communities continues. Our government, together with our allies, has the responsibility to protect civilians. I, as an individual, and one whose experiences in the Holocaust have made me the human being that I am, I must believe that there is a way to transcend politics and nurture compassion and hope for those immersed in war. I thank you very much for coming today to participate in discussion, to invest in conversation, and hopefully in action to create a safer future for the people in Syria. Thank you very much. I spilled water on the computer.